Hi, everybody. I am John McWhorter. I teach linguistics at Columbia University, and I host the podcast about Language Lexicon Valley. And I am elated to have the opportunity to speak to author extraordinaire Erik Larson, who may be best known to most of you for writing the masterful Devil in the White City. But right now, we're going to be talking about the equally masterful, the splendid, and the vile, which is his latest book, which is about the events surrounding and the events comprising the Blitz in England at the beginning of what we now know as World War II. And Erik, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I thoroughly enjoyed a lot of your books, and you're up to all of your tricks. I don't know how you managed to tell a story in such a potato chip, can't stop eating it fashion. But I wanted to ask you something which I kept asking myself, as somebody who tries to write books and tries to come up with topics. What led you, after writing about things like murderers at the Chicago World's Fair, about the sinking of the Lusitania, etc., to choose something as specific? Not that it isn't exciting, but something as specific as not just a history of World War II, which was a pretty exciting time from the late 30s through the mid 40s, but what England went through within the period of basically a year. Why that?
Yeah. Well, it has to do with it goes back to when my family moved from Seattle my wife and I moved from Seattle to New York City. And had this epiphany about the nature of 9/11. I mean, this may sound like a real duh moment for those who actually live in New York, but when we had watched the whole thing unfold in real time from Seattle on CNN, but then arriving in New York, I was immediately struck by how different the experience had to have been for those who were in New York, especially this idea of your home city being attacked. So I actually set out at first to started thinking about doing a book about maybe a typical London family to see how they endured essentially, the first phase of the Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of bombing. And then I started thinking, well, gee, why not do the quintessential London family? And I decided to do Churchill. That's how it came about. That's how it got to be this very sort of specific thing.
That's interesting, because I think many authors would have chosen that family. That would be the fashion these days, to tell it up close and personal. It's about the potatoes. It's about Uncle such and such who gets hurt when he steps outside, etc. But you did something that almost in a way is harder, which is that you took these events, which, let's face it, have been covered by others, and yet you knew that you were going to be able to tell it in such a way that everybody would want to read it again. And what I came away from it with, and I'm going to spare us and the audience with what everybody thinks is coming. I'm going to say something about COVID and the parallels. I'm sure you've answered those questions many times. We're going to leave that out. But when thinking about the Blitz, I must admit that my image is roughly Mrs. Miniver. I've seen the movie, and Greer Garson is sitting there knitting, and you always think about how they got through it. And I must admit that it hadn't occurred to me that, for example, as you show in the book, almost 30,000 people died in London alone, 45,000 people in the UK in general, 5,600 of them were kids. I had never actually thought about that. And this is what I'm left with from your book. And this is a sincere question that I want to ask you, which is this. Churchill is a great man. We're always told that he's a great man. He's a massively entertaining man. But you see from your book, if you follow them from month to month, that Britain was about to lose. I mean, really, they couldn't have done it if America had not come in. So Churchill was pacing and smoking cigars and sending all these cute little notes, and Hopkins and Harriman are coming over. But really, Churchill did these great speeches where he made everybody heartened. But if America hadn't come in, then Britain would have lost anyway. And so I find myself thinking, I understand how magnetic Churchill was. I get that he's special. But I find myself wondering, what do we admire Churchill most for from this vantage point, other than, in a way, being an excellent and articulate cheerleader at a time when, nevertheless, if the U.S. hadn't come in, Britain would have had to surrender to Germany?
Complicated question. I feel that well, Churchill's view was that without the U.S. they couldn't win, but they could fight to a stalemate. And one of his goals was one of his goals was to prevent it from being an excessively long war. Not terribly successful on that front either, of course, but it was really his desire to try to bring Roosevelt in so that the war could come to a quick end. What he was very good at was reeling Roosevelt into the war to the extent that Roosevelt could come into it before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but he was in a very difficult situation in America, which wanted nothing to do with European entanglements and so forth. Also, Roosevelt was thinking about, but had not yet declared, his interest in running for an unprecedented third term. And so it was very, very tricky for Roosevelt. And Churchill, one of the things that he was particularly deft at was finally recognizing how tricky that was. I mean, initially, he just wanted Roosevelt to sort of declare himself and come on in. That's the British thinking about how America should work. But what he realized was this is going to be a much more tricky affair. But he also realized that within the first 24 hours that he would need America's help. There's that moment in the book. He is shaving at his residence. He hadn't yet moved to 10 Downing Street. He is shaving at his residence in Admiralty House, and his ne'er-do-well son Randolph is sitting behind him, challenging him on how Britain could possibly win the war. And Churchill whirls around, throws his razor into the sink, and says, "I shall drag America in." That's literally from day one of his premiership. And he went about it, as he himself later admitted, he went about it with all the skill and ardor of any lover who was pursuing his intended target. And so in a way, that in itself was a particular act of leadership genius on Churchill's part. But you mentioned cheerleader. I think there is so much more to it than him merely being a cheerleader. This was a period when I think Churchill really, you can say an awful lot of bad things about Churchill, and a lot of people do, but this was a period where Churchill really came into his own. And one of the things that he was particularly adept at was, we know he had all these wonderful lines, never has so much been owed by so many to so few, but really I think the beauty of his oratory, of his speeches, was the way he structured, the way he went about talking to this audience who knew that there was an existential threat out there. He was very candid. He began his speeches with a very sober assessment of the reality of the situation, sometimes too sober. He scared some of his audience to death with some of these speeches. And then he would follow with actual reasons for optimism, real reasons, not happy talk, real reasons. And then after that would come the flourishes, these wonderful, wonderful phrases that would really metaphorically, but also literally get people sort of jumping from their chairs, thinking, okay, I'm in this now, I'm in this battle. And that was really a significant thing. This was a powerful thing he did during that period.
I definitely get that. And there's something else about the book that left me wondering, and this is a little bit more frivolous, but I think that the audience should know what they're in for when they read this book, which is that you're this is going to sound strange, very sensual person. You don't see many color photographs of the Blitz, and I feel like I don't need to because of some of the things you get across, such as that you could look at the bombs coming down in the sky, and in a way they were beautiful. Sometimes the parachute bombs looked like flowers, or that at one point a bomb has gone off, I think this is in Coventry, and a tobacco shop is burning and it smells like a big man smoking a pipe, and butcher shop is burning and everybody's thinking, well, it actually smells like the meat that we can't get. You really make us feel that we're there. And even in Devil in the White City, you could smell the hot dogs, you could smell the blood. How do you go about making it so that we are there in something that we feel like we've already been in before? What's your process on that?
In the case of Splendid and Vile, researching this period, I mean, I was blessed with, believe me, there are so many records and so many wonderful, wonderful diaries. It's the diaries that really are the most important thing. Like you mentioned, you called it a parachute mine, but I think it was actually, was it Graham Greene who was talking about flares and how they looked when they were
was
falling?
Graham Greene, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm always on the lookout for those things. These diaries have been read by many, many, many people, but I like to think that I'm looking for something very particular. I'm looking for those little itty bitty details. I mean, if I read an entire 400-page diary and all I get is one really telling little piece, I'm happy. I'm happy. Like one of the things I was really struck by doing the research for this book was one of the salient features of the Blitz was dust. A bomb would fall on a house, and typically the way the Germans timed and built their bombs, the bomb would fall through that house, all the way through the house, all the way into the earthen base underneath, and then detonate. So what you had was you had this effect of this entire structure going up all at once, and these billowing plumes of dust rolling out into the street, dust that would coat people, coat cars, coat everything. And I was really struck by that. That's the kind of thing that I'm really looking for, is like dust. And Graham Greene, in fact, makes a wonderful note in his autobiography, Means of Escape, where he has he talks about how here's this dust, people are coated with dust, and then there's blood, and how the blood is so garishly red against this background of dust. And we can all see that, right? We all know what that's like. But I never would have thought about that except for these diary accounts.
You have a paragraph late in the book. Anybody who's reading this then thinks, well, then what happened? Even if you know what happened. So in Pearl Harbor, you do one paragraph where you sum up World War II. And, I don't have time to read it here, but it's just this perfect, almost Churchillian, Gibbon-esque paragraph. You sum up World War II, you make it sound like a story that's never been told. A lot of people don't know that people who write nonfiction are writers. You notice how just like drink is shorthand for drinking alcohol, does he drink doesn't mean Sprite. Well, do you write means do you write novels? And it's as if we nonfiction writers don't exist, or there's something else that we do. Yet clearly you write. What is your process in writing? Like mine is frankly to just sit down and crank it out and show it to somebody. I don't revise much. What is your process?
Often people refer to me as a historian, and I don't think of myself as a historian. I think of myself as a writer of history. I'm drawn not so much by the desire, not at all by the desire to inform. I am drawn by story. I am drawn to real life nonfiction subjects that have an inherent story, a natural narrative arc. You ask about what's my process. I mean, I am so compulsive about rewriting and editing. I mean, I have about 4 feet worth of drafts still in my office. To me, it's
wow.
To me that, and maybe you feel this way as well. To me, I am happiest. I just feel this wonderful sense of, oh, now I can really begin my writing life when I have the first draft done. Because then, all the angst is gone. I know I have, most of the angst is gone. I know I have a book, and now the trick is to make it a really good book. Now with this, I have to say, this was the toughest book that I have written thus far.
How come?
Because of the sheer volume of material that has been written about Churchill. I had to make a strategic decision very early on that I wasn't going to try to touch bases just because the scholars wanted me to touch those bases. I also decided that because of my window, I had a very particular window. How on earth did Churchill, his family, and his advisors, how did they survive 57 consecutive nights of bombing and 6 more months of intensifying raids, but at longer intervals because of the weather? How did they do it? It was a very particular lens. And interestingly, nobody else had used that lens to look at Churchill before. And so I made a strategic decision. I'm going to learn the landscape, the Churchillian landscape, but I am not going to try to read everything because that would be a fool's errand.
It's impossible.
And then I decided, okay, so I'm going to learn the landscape, and then I'm going to go right into the archives, the primary materials, because that's where I really feel comfortable. And I was confident that reasonably confident that with my lens, I would be able to find new things to say about Churchill. Now, I'm not saying that nobody went through these documents before, nobody went through these archives before, but each scholar brings to the subject something very, very different. With my lens, I was looking for particular things that, frankly, most historians would probably, most biographers, whatever, most would probably have ignored. And actually, this is one reason I don't use any research assistants, because I'm not convinced that somebody else would have my instinct about what to look for.
I feel the same way.
Yeah. And so going into the archives, I was actually delighted to find that I am able to say new things. I also got extremely lucky, getting some access to some materials that I don't believe were actually ever effectively used.
I can't wait to see what the next thing will be. Who said splendid and vile? You know that I wanted to end this by saying, as the great, and I know it was in your book, but I couldn't find it this morning. So the title derives directly from one character's diary. This is John Colville, who was one of Churchill's private secretaries. He was one of his cadre of private secretaries. I actually think of them as apprentice prime ministers. They were very smart, very hardworking young men. John Colville is one of these. He's a character in his own right in this book. And he kept against all national security laws, he kept a very detailed daily diary of life at 10 Downing Street. It's the touchstone for everybody who writes about Churchill. But one night, he is watching an air raid from a bedroom window, as one does. He's watching an air raid from a bedroom window, and he is struck by the beauty of the night. There's this sable sky, searchlights, bombs blowing up. It's just, he is struck. He makes it sound beautiful, exactly.
Well, he is struck by the sheer beauty of the night. And he talks about it being a juxtaposition of natural splendor and human vileness. And right as soon as I read that, I thought, that's my title, The Splendid and the Vile.
That must have felt great. Eric, you wrote a wonderful book, and I am really glad that I was asked to read it. One final thing. Churchill spoke like a leader. He was very conscious of doing that. I think even more than most people of his time. Is that an old-fashioned quality that we might dismiss, just like we would dismiss whatever toilet water or cologne or cigar that he used? Or is it something we could do with better today? And I don't mean Trump. That's too easy. Let's say that we're just talking about a normal president. Nevertheless, that president would not communicate like Churchill. Are we missing something?
We're totally missing something, and I hope that we get it back. But it cuts to all the broad palette of things that actually made Churchill in this time a true leader and the ideal leader. It wasn't just his speeches. It's also the fact that the man, for all his rapier wit and so forth, the man had a lot of compassion. He had this knack for being able to express empathy and having people understand that it was a real thing. But he also had this real, he understood the power of symbolic acts. That if he was fearless, if he showed himself to be fearless, and he was, if he showed himself to be fearless, others would be fearless as well. I mean, courage, fearlessness is in fact infectious. But there's a final little subtle thing that I love about Churchill during this period. And again, I have to say, during this period, you can find an awful lot that's awful about Churchill. But one very compelling thing that he did during this period, during his speeches, is another aspect of his speeches. Because he was so well read, because he had a great understanding of the broad, grand sweep of English history, he was able to insert his audience, the beleaguered Londoners and people getting bombed out of their homes and so forth. He was able to insert their challenge, their travails into the broad history of Britain and make them feel as if they were part of that grand history and that they had a role in carrying it on. And that's a real art.
As is the art of letting interviews go when one is out of time. Erik, it has been an absolute honor. I'm glad that we could talk about this.
Thank you, John. And I'm sorry we had to do it under these pandemic conditions, but maybe next time.
We shall see. Thank you.
Thank you.